I think we stopped at a Dairy Queen, but I went inside and I got a vibe. No one said anything. I don't know exactly how to describe a vibe, but we went and we turned that into a rest stop and immediately left. And I don't know if it's something that, someone was giving us looks for being a mixed couple. I don't know if I imagined it. And I'm not that paranoid guy. I'm really not. Like I said, growing up, and when people hear me talk, I can tell when I've met someone on the phone and then they meet me in person and they see that I'm black, they're shocked because the way I speak, you don't speak black or you speak white or something like that. So I'm used to not having to deal with anything like that. So I don't know what triggered it, Tegan. Again, it may have been nothing, but I think there was a reason that I just made it. We stopped and got out as quickly as we could.
No! Don't be sitting down, king without a crown. No time for hesitation, if I slip I won't rebound. Look in life and notice I control my own fate. Disappointment stumbles in, how much can my soul take? But I'm doing this for more than me, live my life accordingly. Know the bigger picture is depicted through the work I bring. Back to my people, pose a challenge, we can make it. Prefer dream catching over all the dream chasing. That mean I believe I was born to achieve.
Welcome to the Ideas for the Open-Minded TeeCast. Here, we explore social issues with unique people and perspectives through productive conversation while purposefully excluding politicism to promote good standalone ideas. Our guests and our listeners are people with open minds and open ears who seek to learn from others so that we can make this world a better place. So let's do this. Victor Neal is a unique cat. If you haven't heard of him, you're one of very few. Vic is a marketing and communications professional, a manager, a leader, a successful family man, and currently is the director of development for one of my absolute favorite charities, Hope Farm, Inc., an after-school program that mentors boys of incarcerated or murdered parents. Growing up in Panama, his social view is quite unique. I was going to ask you to tell us a little bit about your concept of race relations while you were growing up and some of the key differences between what you saw where you grew up, which was not in the U.S., at least a part of the time, and what you've seen here, even though maybe we'll dig into the age difference and perhaps what you might have known and not known at the time.
Sure. So one thing that I'd never trade for the world was having the experience to grow up overseas. One of the main reasons is that you talk about melting pots. When you grow up in the military, you are, in essence, in a melting pot. Basically, you're living in a U.S. territory on base. You could consider it U.S. territory, but you're immersed in this whole other culture, a whole other country. And what you're also immersed in is you've got this group of people who are as diverse as they come. And if you look at the military, for example, my dad was in the Air Force. He is from Jamaica. My mother is from Panama, and I was born in New York. And a lot of my friends had fathers who were either from the United States and mothers who were from another country. And they met while their fathers were in the service doing whatever when they were stationed overseas. So growing up, obviously you notice color. You see that as immediately noticeable when you see somebody. But it didn't affect the way me, and I say we, the way we treated one another as far as the group of friends I grew up with. My dad retired in Panama. So instead of just serving a 3 to 4 year term and then coming back stateside, we stayed in Panama all the way through junior college. So I had this group of friends that was so diverse.
About how old, what age span are you talking about in Panama?
So I'm talking about 2 years old till I moved here when I had just turned 21.
Oh, okay.
So 19.
Your whole,
yeah. The majority of my life up until when I moved here. Coming here was a little eye-opening because after I had this established group of friends for all these years, I came up to a huge country, to a huge state, and didn't know anyone. So that would be different for anybody. But going to a private school where a lot of the kids that I was going to school with, they kind of grew up like I did and had their little group of friends, except what was for a long time, except those groups were a lot more homogenous. So a lot of these kids, I feel, their first interactions with anyone of a different race or anyone of a different socioeconomic status or anything, that never happened until they got to TCU. And I never felt threatened or afraid when I moved here, but there are times when you can feel a certain vibe, when you can feel that things are different. And that's something I honestly never experienced growing up in Panama.
Was part of what made you feel different just being in an environment that was primarily white? I mean, by a landslide, we're talking about the populace of TCU, whether it be the professors or the student body. Was that part of a self-conscious type of a feeling that you had in addition to the vibe, or is it contributor to the vibe you're talking about?
It would definitely be a contributor, just because, like I said, so many of my friends were white. They had differing tones of skin. And like I said, coming to TC, it was so much more homogenous where everyone looked a lot different. And I really felt at times that I stuck out, not because anyone had singled me out, but just because when you're the only black guy in a classroom, you notice, you know?
Yeah.
So
There's a lot of people that don't appreciate that try to just say, hey, I'm nice to everybody, I see whatever. And they don't appreciate that you're sitting in a restaurant and notice that there's, 400 people here and there's one black couple here. And to try to reverse the role and think about what kind of self-conscious process that would be for somebody to be in, even if it's not discriminatory, just generally that vibe and putting themselves in that situation where a white couple was the only white couple in a black establishment. It just lends itself to a level of uncomfortability, mostly because of the way the United States is set up, I would think, which leads me back to a little bit about when you were growing up. Obviously, you had an identity. You said there were different people from all walks and different colors and everything else. So assuming that everybody has a color identity and knowing that probably the only race that tries not to use their color as in an identity is whites, which they should, because if you're white, you're white. And if you're not, you're something else. But I think in the US, we've made white the standard. So you're a minority or you're a white. And kind of a lot of the conversations go that way. How did you or other people kind of acknowledge any of that? I mean, you can't just be a kid and see different colors and not think, like you said, you can't not notice it. So how was that acknowledged? Was there any discrimination at all?
I'm sure there was. The discrimination that you saw in Panama, though, was more based on socioeconomic status. You had the rich neighborhoods. There's a pretty big middle class in Panama, but the drop off from middle class, or when you go from upper class to middle class and then middle class to lower class, is pretty steep. As far as middle class and lower class probably closer to one another, and then the upper class just on a whole nother level. So that's where you really saw it manifest itself, because the kids I went to school with, and when I was in high school, it wasn't just American kids. Panamanian kids could go to school there too if their parents paid enough money, which was interesting. But it was a great education. But you'd notice that a lot of the rich kids that were fair-skinned would assimilate in this melting pot, probably because it was easier to do. But when you went on the outside, I would argue that if they had people working at their homes, maids were real common in Panama, that they were going to be darker skinned. So the people that they would hang out with at school, they probably wouldn't hang out with them if they weren't going to the same entitled school as them, if that makes any sense.
So the racial lines, similar to here, are kind of drawn socioeconomically also.
Very much. Very much. It's interesting. You mentioned a story and it wasn't that someone was discriminating against me, but true story. I took a class in college that was called American Minority Groups. I'm sure it was to satisfy some requirement. But again, I was the only black kid in the class. And I got to know the professor. He was Asian. I got to know him pretty well. And near the end of the semester, there was 2 times where someone asked a question in general about, well, what do black people think about this? And his response, which I caught because it was tongue in cheek, was he said, well, I don't know. Why don't you just ask Victor? And so sure enough, someone would turn around and ask me this question. I thought it was interesting that they didn't realize that he was joking because I didn't speak for the entire black population.
But neither may he. Of course, he has an education, which, how did that align with what you've seen and what you learned growing up about the black populace in terms of what was taught, or any that you might know? I mean, I guess that's you're mostly familiar with that, and you've been in 2 different environments. So how much of that really aligned with things that you had seen, and how much of it seemed
Odd.
Americanized even.
Sure.
You know, I mean, the history books that we have are.
It didn't align because there was no point in my upbringing overseas where I felt like I was speaking for a whole population based on color or based on any correct characteristic other than, hey, what does the basketball team think about this? But to me, that's not the same.
Right.
So it didn't align at all. I did think it was funny knowing the professor, and just he kind of gave me that look and a little wink. But I thought he realized that it could be racially charged, but knew that this was more an opportunity to teach and to let people know, hey, it's about individuals. This guy here doesn't speak for the entire Black population.
And yeah, I assume were you the only minority in the entire class with just all whites, or were there other minorities in the class as well?
There were no other Black kids. There may have been other some Hispanic kids and Asian kids, but I don't recall.
So do you remember even how much of it you felt like was enlightening at all, or did it feel like? And I'm not trying to make a case against anything that TCU teaches or whatever. I just know that's the experience that you had, and the experience that I've had on ethics and racial diversity and all these different things that we have are super, super generic, surface level stuff that nobody really gets into the weeds, and the weeds are where the important things come out. So I'm just curious, at a college level, you would kind of expect more of that you'd have breakdowns in the class and people, debating significant issues and things like that. Did you see that happening at all?
Not at that level. And you mentioned, was it enlightening for me or enlightening for others?
Anyone. I mean, did you feel like the material was enlightening in general? I mean, not that you couldn't learn anything, but was it kind of generic, or was it, deep topic discussions about things that that you're able to learn about others and vice versa?
It was somewhere in between. And the thing that I appreciated was growing up overseas. A lot of the history I just wasn't up to speed with because I didn't grow up here. But just some of the things that are more systemic and how certain minority groups were viewed and what their roles were. Just sitting there and learning that and understanding. And mind you, I love where I grew up. I knew racism existed, but not having experienced that racism, it was hard to read and see how people were treated based on their skin color, knowing that that wasn't that long before I was, I was born, and things like that were allowed by law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, things like that are still going on. They're just illegal, but they're still happening. So it was just really interesting to read the accounts and get the historical aspect.
Knowing that education is an important part of making some strides in understanding how to fix some of the systemic issues, because a lot of people see that as kind of a ghost issue anyway, because what specifically is it? But the key to that is going back and relearning history from a perspective of everyone instead of a perspective of American glory. Is there anything that you can think of? And again, I'm not talking about TCU specifically, but perhaps in schools or universities, but especially pre-university, when you're going through Texas history or U.S. history or anything. Is there anything that you've thought of over the course of time that you feel like would be really important for other people to learn, so that for the first time they're not hearing a lot of these issues come to bear when they're 30 years old?
Well, again, just history. I mean, when you go and look up things like the first Black student, the first African American student, the first female student, and I'm not just talking about at TCU, but at Texas universities in general, or universities in general, I think those are the things that people need to be aware of. Because a lot of times people think civil rights movement was really strong, all this stuff that was going on in the 60s, that's so far behind me. Well, I was born in the 60s. And obviously, for someone born in the 60s, the way it affected my parents, so one generation that precedes me, so a very direct generation, that was their reality. That's what they were living. So knowing that, I think is strong.
And did you learn anything similar to that when you were coming up and through high school or junior high or anything in Panama? I'm obviously very unfamiliar with how things are taught out there in terms of history. Did they do Panamanian history, or what did you go through in terms of history lessons and stuff when you were coming up?
See, that's funny. My wife and I had a discussion about this just this weekend, talking about the 4th of July and what was celebrated in Panama. So there's a different Independence Day in Panama, but the one that gets a lot of attention is the one that's celebrated by the Americans, the 4th of July, because we've made it into such a big thing. So growing up overseas, even when my dad retired from the Air Force, he still worked as an American in a civilian capacity overseas. So I went to the same Department of Defense schools. So a lot of people, when they hear me talk, they're like, "You don't have an accent, but you went to school overseas." Well, yeah, everyone I went to school with spoke English. So the curriculum, I'm sure they got it from whatever was standard curriculum here in the United States. We did the Pledge of Allegiance every day.
Hmm.
We talked about U.S. history. So things that kids in the same grade levels would be learning here, we were definitely learning down there.
Well, I guess you didn't have any life experiences or anything to compare it to in terms of the disparity between what actually happened and what needs to be taught so that people have a proper perspective. I mean, there's no country's origin that doesn't have a horrible past involved with the good things as well. And I assume that your parents educated you a little bit about racism and issues that you could expect. And did that align? If so, did that align with anything that you learned? I just remember learning about Christopher Columbus discovering America, and we all dress up like Indians and have a play, and we thought it was so fun. And it just isn't the way it was. Nobody talked about raping and pillaging and taking over the land at all. And the fact that Christopher Columbus might not have been the first guy and he was a slave owner, blah, blah, blah. You know, none of that stuff comes out.
It wasn't
until
all fun.
No, and you have to go back and like try to find that stuff. That's stuff that I think that's the stuff I'm talking about that should be taught in schools so that we have a proper perspective of the good and the bad that has gotten us to where we are, instead of being adults and set in your ways and then somebody trying to bring up something that you were never taught. And it's harder for people to believe if they were never taught it at an age where they're having their first exposure to what, U.S. history had.
Sure. There's good and bad to everything. So my parents would keep me a little grounded, and I don't recall specific situations where they would address racism, but I'm sure it was addressed. And you mentioned, so addressing that maybe at the school level is something that wasn't done. But I think I would have appreciated knowing how brutal it was. It wasn't, hey, there are these, Martin Luther King leading these peaceful protests and eventually things change. I mean, the ugly side really needs to be illustrated. People need to know that even at young levels, because if you know how bad it was, then it makes it so easy for you to understand that, hey, I don't want it to be this bad again.
Right.
And then you don't leave yourself open to these superficial views and what you see on movies, what you see in the media. People really need to know the good and the bad, and the ugly,
and help you identify the things when they are across in front of your face. Right.
Yeah.
So you felt like essentially from what you've heard and from the class you took at TCU, you feel like they were fairly comparable to any typical U.S. history class that anywhere in the United States would have put on.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I guess as we segue in, you lead me to another point, which is you're in interracial marriage, and I don't know exactly to what extent that has affected you. You've obviously married up, as did I. So you have a beautiful wife who is also friends with my wife, ironically enough, and very smart.
Well, it's more than just friends. I mean, they go back to 4th, 5th grade playing basketball together.
Yes.
Which I think is hilarious.
Well, it's more hilarious than my wife's because she's 5'2". But they're both beautiful and smart and carry themselves in a way that is very confident. And then you have that unique dynamic, which is only unique because society in the U.S. makes it unique, right? And in Panama, this probably would have been not so frowned upon, certainly in the community that you grew up in. But do you have any issues, especially as things get lit up around racial, divides and political issues and things? Do you ever run into issues with that with her?
I have not. The only time that I ran into an issue was about 5 or 6 years ago, coming back home from San Antonio, visiting my mom and sister and brother. We didn't want to get on I-35, so we took back roads. We took 281 through Glen Rose. And at a certain point, we stopped for a restroom break, and we were going to eat something too. I think we stopped at a Dairy Queen. But I went inside and I got a vibe. No one said anything. I don't know exactly how to describe a vibe. But we went and we turned that into a rest stop and immediately left. And I don't know if it's something that, someone was giving us looks for being a mixed couple. I don't know if I imagined it. And I'm not that paranoid guy. I'm really not. like I said, growing up. And, when people hear me talk, I can tell when I've met someone on the phone and then they meet me in person and they see that I'm Black, they're shocked because the way I speak. You don't speak Black, or you speak white or something like that.
Mhm.
So I'm used to not having to deal with anything like that. So I don't know what triggered it, Tegan. Again, it may have been nothing, but I think there was a reason that I just, we stopped and got out as quickly as we could.
Did she feel the same vibe? I assume you talked about it?
No,
She
no,
didn't notice it?
no. And obviously, with everything going on now, we've had conversations about how things affect her and how things affect me. And it's the same way. Maybe if we were somewhere and she was the only tall blonde and she noticed it, I wouldn't notice it because it doesn't affect me.
Mhm.
But we've been having some different conversations about what might happen, what could be, especially raising three interracial kids, three biracial kids. And what does that mean? What does it look like for them when they get to a point where race becomes an issue? Because it's going to become an issue. And I don't say that as it's going to be positive or negative, but it's going to be confronted. Someone's going to ask one day, well, what are you? What's your heritage? What race are you? And you've seen my kids. I got a kid with blonde hair, um, which I would have never guessed. And I got a kid with black hair and one with brown hair. And looking at them, they're pretty fair skinned.
So how do you approach that? So your kids are young, and yet at any age, at any given time, somebody could ask them a question associated with that. Have you addressed that, or do you have a plan about how you're going to address that with them in terms of, hey, if somebody asks this is, or just educate them about their background, or give them some kind of a mechanism for defense against somebody that is actually a racist. They might have bad luck enough to run into somebody like that.
Yeah, there is no plan. We talk about it a lot, but there's no plan. With all the tension going on now, I mentioned this on another interview I did. Sesame Street did a special that was going to talk about race. It's about 2 or 3 Saturdays ago. So we thought, hey, maybe this is a great way to introduce the kids to race. It's Sesame Street. So we sat down and started to watch it, and they could care less. They paid no attention. So that attempt did not go well and didn't work.
They're right in that wheelhouse. They didn't like Sesame Street.
They hate Sesame Street.
Really?
They didn't care to watch this special, and it was 10 in the morning, so that's the wild time for them. But at some point, I don't know if there's an appropriate time to tackle it, other than the time when it becomes an issue and they ask a question. Why did such and such say this? Why did this happen? Why am I seeing this on TV? Fortunately, I've got a 7, 5, and 2-year-old, so they're kind of, everything's just all fun and games for them. So they don't notice what's going on. They do know that we're in virus time. They do know that limits their ability to get out and do things with their friends. I don't know that any of the protests, if they catch wind of that or even understand what that is, but at some point they will, and they'll start asking questions.
Are they at their schools? They're in kind of a white environment in general, or?
You know what? The school by our house is it's predominantly Hispanic.
Okay.
Which is interesting because the neighborhood we live in is predominantly white. But the school right down the street and across the highway is predominantly Hispanic.
They're a minority. And obviously, your kids, in more ways than one, are a minority because people are going to view them one way or the other. And the fact that they're biracial makes them in even a more unique situation. Yeah. And they're even more unique, though. Sometimes biracial kids aren't even accepted by blacks or whites, and then they find themselves really as a tweener trying to figure out their identity. And like you said, I'm not that I would expect everyone has a plan. That's very presumptuous of me to have a formal plan. But the first time you see somebody of a different color as a kid, I remember one of my best friends was a black kid, and it was really obvious that he was the only black kid. I mean, it was just a piece of information that I didn't know what to do with, but a standout is a standout. Sometimes those conversations come up, and when it's with kids, they don't even know what the hell they're talking about half the time, but they're going to bring it up because it's something obvious.
Yeah, it'll definitely be brought up. And I don't know if at their school, I don't, prior to this pandemic hitting, this was the first year we were taking them to that school. So we were starting to get to know the teachers and the principal and the parents. And then the virus hit. So at least in that first part of the year, the school year, I saw a lot of friendly faces. I didn't see anything that thought, hey, I need to be leery of this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was that time when you were finally starting to know some of the other parents. So at drop off, you could have that little conversation. But now, who knows when that's going to start happening again?
And it's unique because, white people don't think about that because, again, white is treated like the norm. And then if you're not white, then you have to deal with having that kind of a talk, which is disappointing, but it is what it is. I was just curious. So you graduated TCU, you started working at TCU for some years, and then you ran into an opportunity to go work somewhere else. Tell me a little bit about that and how that unfolded.
So I was an advertising and PR major. That's called it's Stratcom now, strategic communication. And the reason I went that route, Tegan, was because I was either going to become an attorney, but I didn't have the time or the money for law school, or something that had to do with me running my mouth. So I tend to meet people easily. So I went advertising and PR. When I graduated, I worked at a PR firm here for about 2 years. And the reason I bring it up is because things always come full circle. Working at a PR firm, we had banks, insurance companies, some pretty prominent partners that we did work for. So I got to know a lot of folks. Then I went to work at TCU. Obviously, here in Fort Worth, TCU is a huge part of the community. And I got to know a lot of people over my time at TCU. And where this is going is that now that I'm in fun, and I was doing marketing, PR again at TCU. But now that I'm in marketing and fundraising for a nonprofit, a lot of the relationships that I forged 20 years ago that I've kind of kept in contact with, maintained these relationships over the years, they're starting to come back around. Because in this town, like in any town, it's about who you know. And having the ability to have these people that I have this social capital that I can now take advantage of has been pretty neat.
Yeah, and you're working for Hope Farm. Tell us a little bit about that, just so that when I have further questions, I mean, you don't have to give a giant spiel, but obviously it's an important organization.
Yeah. So working at Hope Farm is a leadership program for boys who don't have fathers, which is interesting because that's kind of how I met you through your involvement with Hope Farm, even though I had met you before because of our wives being friends forever.
Right.
So we take boys as young as 5. We try to hold on through high school graduation. So our boys are anywhere between 5 and 18. Morningside, the campus, the oldest campus, the original campus is 20 something years old. Hope Farm itself as an entity is 30 years old. About a year and a half ago, we opened a new branch in Como over on the west side. And in late January, we opened a new branch over in Dallas. So we've got 3 Hope Farm branches.
Are they all low income neighborhoods that they're in?
Yeah. So Morningside, Como, and then I guess in Dallas, you'd call it just South Dallas.
Okay.
Off of MLK and 45. So some pretty rough parts of town because that's where our clientele are. I think in our Morningside neighborhood, Tegan, the percentage of families that are 2-parent families, I think it was something like 16%.
Wow.
So dealing with fatherless boys, we serve them and we serve their moms or their aunt or their grandmother, typically a female parent that's taking care of them.
How has the escalated environment and racial tension and promotion of BLM and things like that affected you guys? Obviously, the virus has affected your ability to work very well, although you've come up with some creative ways to keep the organization running. But in terms of the kids, since you have kids from 5, you also have high school age kids and everything. Have you had any opportunities to hear any of them out since they still live in those neighborhoods and have issues and that they want to discuss? Is there an outlet for that?
There is an outlet for that. So obviously everything went to virtual. So I do know that the different age groups of the kids and then the Hope Farm staff member that they are assigned to, I imagine this is an opportunity for them to forge some relationships, which is a really big part of what we do since we're an after school program. When the boys come on campus, mentorship, leadership, tutoring, these are a lot of things that they can do. And Bible study is a big one that they can do, not one-on-one, but small groups to one staff member. I don't know how much discussion has gone on about the current state of affairs. I think that's probably harder to do in a virtual setting. than in person. But what we're continuing to do is support them, whether it be with donations of equipment, laptops, some hotspots for Wi-Fi so that kids can do school and so they can do our projects online, delivering meals. So we continue to do our core stuff, but as far as having those critical face-to-face conversations, that's probably suffered.
And you guys mentor the mothers as well, or the caretakers in most cases, which are the mothers or the grandmothers, right?
Yeah, and that's a good point. So we call it the Mom's Resource Program, but sometimes it's not their mom. It might be a grandmother, it might be an aunt, it might be a sister, but it's that one parental figure that they still have in their lives. So yeah, a lot of the focus goes to the boys because they're always in our program. The moms meet less frequently and after hours, but everyone wants to see a photo of a little 5-year-old boy. I mean, that's really touching. And it's not that people don't want to help the moms, but they just don't get a chance to interact with them as much. But we do support them.
Recently, I've been learning more and more about how white supremacists tend to think. And more often than not, the people that I try to bring into the fold, hence this podcast type of thing, with people that may disagree politically or be on the other side of the fence, so to speak, but are willing to listen. They've got ears and they're willing to sit down and have a discussion, to the extent that even if we leave the discussion and they haven't come to my side, it's okay because we're learning and I'm learning from them equally. So, but for the most part, what we see is extremism on both sides, what hits the news and everything else. So that's where all of this stuff getting politicized. And one of the things that is kind of an inherent belief is that Blacks are biologically less intelligent people, and not based on anything other than a selective examples that they want to bring forth and things like that. Has there ever been a situation where you've had an opportunity to speak to anyone? I know you have tons of white friends, and when issues like this come up, a lot of times you find out things about your friends, as have I, that you never knew before, because when you're just hanging out, and it's not, and I personally don't dig talking politics and talking all that kind of stuff in great depth unless it's kind of a planned thing and you've got hours on hours. So have you run into any of those situations where you've had opportunities to talk or even opportunities to learn who better to ignore? It's kind of an open question, but
no, that's so in the past, I'm pretty laid back. And on social media, I get it. You got differing opinions. There's a lot of in between on a lot of issues, but there are a lot of things that there is right and there's wrong, and there's a lot of things that I feel strongly about. So, like you said, I'm surprised at some of the friends that I've had on social media, just to hear their positions and to hear what they say, and the ones that I've been surprised in a negative manner are probably a lot more than the ones that I thought, that kind of surprises me in a positive way. I thought this person, because again, we all have our misperceptions of people. We all sometimes look at things in a wrong way. But I found a lot of things that were eye opening in a bad way, Tegan. And it's like, wow, I can't believe this person. And the point I get to is if you really know someone and care about them and they have an opinion that may be controversial, but you're not willing to get back to what you said. You're not even willing to listen to why they feel that way, what experiences have led them to believe that, then you're never going to change. And I think running into people like that, it makes you think, well, do I need this person in my life right now? Because a lot of them you really don't.
And are they changeable? Some of them that have the more extraordinary statements that come out that you never realized were in their minds, you have to weigh whether or not you have the time and energy to handle it. But I think it's important. There's been a lot of people during this process that I've seen be turned off by people calling. I know I've heard you mention before that people would call you and ask, "Hey, what can I do? I'm a white dude and I have no idea." And I've seen a lot of Black people be turned off by that. And I understand why they're frustrated, because they're like, look, I've been dealing with this all my life and you're just now asking me. However, ignorance is ignorance. And if you're ignorant, it means you don't even know what you're doing wrong half the time. Sometimes you are straight racist and you're doing things purposefully and you have your own agenda, but other times you're just being a moron and don't realize you're being a moron. And so you need some of that EDU. And it's difficult to find a place to educate yourself. So have you had any breakdown conversations? I know you and I have sat down and talked about stuff like this before. And, I swore we were going to put some of the stuff to a mic one of these days, and it's just better time now than any. But
and here we are. So yeah, I have had those, and you're right. There's certain people that are racist. There's certain people that just don't know any better, and they're not getting the point, and they're different than the ones who are actively getting the point and still don't care.
yeah, there's tons of us not getting the point though, and I'm actively trying to learn. I don't want to be presumptuous and pretend I know everything. There's a lot of issues out there.
Yeah, but at least you're still trying to learn.
Yeah.
There's so many people out there that don't want to hear it, that they've taken one side or another. Especially we're talking about the protesting, we're talking about wearing masks and how that's been politicized. Because if you paint with broad brushstrokes and you say anything about a whole group of any population, then you're stereotyping. And if you refuse to understand that and look at how individuals should be listened to as individuals instead of as a group, then why are you even bothering? So I'm in a group with some others that a lot of them. And one of the things that we're talking about is looking at certain issues and having people take some sort of pledge to say, hey, I'm at least going to listen to the other side before I make a judgment. Because, and this, my wife and I don't see eye to eye on everything. So if we're not seeing eye to eye, then it's ridiculous to expect that you and any other person, let alone a huge group of people, are going to get along and agree on all the facts on every issue. So the pledge that we want to take is that not only do you open your mind up, but that you also agree to start holding people accountable. I know a lot of times I'll hear something or see something or read something and I'll think one way and I'll go blab to my wife, can you believe this and that? And that's not helping solve the problem. So being more active and actually, for lack of a better term, confronting someone, not necessarily to set them straight, but to get them to open their minds.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, man, it's just been so easy to say that's just such and such being himself or being herself, but that's not changing anything.
Right.
So to actively say something is what I think a lot of us need to be doing more of.
Do you need to tell me anything while we're here?
No. The hard part about it, raising 3 kids, is just sometimes you get in these discussions with people. And like I said, if someone's being racist or hard-headed, that's one thing. But if I think someone's listening and really cares, I almost feel like I owe them my answer. But when you're changing a diaper, or it's time to bathe the kids, or it's time to put them down for bed, then that message has got to wait.
Yeah.
And depending on how easily the kids go to bed when you come out, you might be too tired. Or you might want to do something other than get on social media and try and explain a viewpoint, no matter how good your intentions are. So it's made it really hard. But then again, it's probably a lot more reasonable to expect to have conversations, maybe not affect people, but you can't have all these conversations in person because a lot of the people that you see on social media, you don't see in real life anyway.
Right.
So you got to have some sort of forum to engage and to have these discussions, but it's just really hard, especially doing it on a cell phone. If you had a keyboard and you could type a little faster instead of thumb typing everything.
So in this group, are you having any of those discussions within the group about having to move forward, or is it just kind of manifest into something where you agree to disagree? Is it working for you?
So the group, we just met the first time 2 weeks ago, and this group, we're all on the same page. So we're not necessarily having those conversations where we feel it's someone who maybe needs to expand their perspective. We're still trying to plan on how we can each use our circles of influence to start some sort of grassroots thinking that maybe can start spreading. Because if I go and I talk to 50 people that I don't know, they don't care. But if I talk to one person that I know and I can make a difference or open their mind, and then they do that, then you start to have this grassroots effort that can start to spread. I just think you've got to do it at that level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's a great way to put it, because then you have the time to invest too. You're not looking at 20 people and trying to put it into text, think about how you want to write it. You can give them a call and go sit down and
and then it's someone you know.
Yeah.
When it's someone you know, if you tell me something, if I see a commercial on TV and it's telling me to buy this, and then I come and I see you and you say, hey, I've tried this, not knowing I've seen the commercial, then maybe I'm going to go buy it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot more powerful of an endorsement.
Yeah. You're at least interested in scoping it out further at that point.
Yeah.
So this reminds me of something. It may be a diversion back to some of Hope Farm, and let me know if you want to answer this or not. But I found this to be something that I also observed, but it affected me a lot differently because it didn't really affect me in a particularly negative way. And you'll understand why when I present this question. So I knew someone that I actually helped get a job at Hope Farm. I don't know the job capacity, but they worked inside the facility most of the time. And so they witnessed the program, inner workings, got to see behind the scenes and everything else, but everything's always a little different behind the scenes. But they ended up leaving. This particular person may or may not have had really their own agenda as far as why they left. But one of the things that they voiced to me that they thought they were actually really quite disgusted with was the fact that you have primarily African-American children and a couple of white kids, a couple of Hispanic kids, right? I would say that about accurate. Do you know that?
I don't know percentage-wise, but that's very accurate.
Yeah, okay.
Predominantly African-American.
Right, which is, again, reflective of the communities that you're building in.
Sure.
So, and the primary resource that you're pulling from are wealthy white businessmen and investors and philanthropists of different kinds. You do events and you do sponsored events, everything else. And it was, to this particular person, it was a turnoff to see that type of thing where they felt like this is just a way to kind of buy their guilt away. And it's something that I think I've broached this topic with you once before, but we may have been interrupted. I was just curious on your perspective there. It's a broad question when you talk about whether or not you want to leverage the community, because obviously you want to help build the community up. And I already know you're building the community up. You're helping the mothers, you're mentoring the mothers, everything else. Does that become a topic of conversation, or has it ever been anything that you consider?
I've thought about it. It hasn't really become a topic of conversation as far as something that we talk about and need to address.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the dynamics of the people who support Hope Farm versus the people who work there versus the people, the populations that we serve, one of my goals is always to get, if someone wants to make a donation to Hope Farm, someone that I don't know that well, I'll tell them, hey, before you do that, why don't you come and meet some of the boys? Because I don't want anyone to think, hey, this is just, you know what? I'm going to help some Black kids out and give some money. I want you to come there and I want you to see what you're actually affecting and see that these kids are human, and then start forging some sort of long-term relationship. Because writing checks helps, but that's not going to make problems go away if people aren't doing it for the right reasons and if they're not aware of the impact, the role that we play in society. I mean, the change that we're trying to instill in these boys can be generational. I mean, think of the kids that, had they had a chance to have some sort of strong mentoring in their lives, maybe would have made or wouldn't have made that one decision that led them down the wrong path. And they ended up incarcerated, deceased, unemployed, whatever.
No question.
And just how that filters down to other generations that may come. So that's my bit. And I've thought about it because it is what it is. If you look at our donors, percentage wise, it's probably the same, just different race as if you look at the population that we serve. Whether that's good or bad, I don't think it's either. But it is what it is. And if people are willing to help, especially if they can come out, Tegan, and I find a lot of folks, when they come out there and they see the kids, it really hits them. The fact that they'd come out there tells me they probably are doing it for the right reasons. And once they come out there and engage, and you see how they interact with the kids, at that point, it's like, hey, if I can help another person, not necessarily that, hey, I have this white guilt that I'm trying to unload.
Yeah, and it was just a perception that was shared with me by that person. I'd never had it before, but again, it's just another one of those things where being a white person, being a donor, being a volunteer, whatever, it doesn't occur to me, even though I've actually noticed it, but it doesn't occur to me as something that's particularly negative. But environmentally, you're looking at it, it seems like there could be something wrong with that. Obviously, I know the intentions and the heart of Hope Farm and what you're doing, and I know what the funds are going to. I mean, there's not like you have some, rich bigot that walks in and says, I want you to spend this on something. And you're saying, okay, we'll spend it on something else. I mean, you're not trying to solve a white social issue through Hope Farm. And that was the perception that they had. I just thought it was very interesting having it be somebody that had been involved on both sides of that, raised kids, African-American kids and everything else. It just provoked a little thought, but it certainly is not an indictment. I didn't mean to imply that it was.
No, I don't think you were implying that at all, but all of our donors really are into it for the right reasons. They have great hearts, and I don't think I've never had anyone question why we don't have more Hispanic kids or more white kids. Like you said, every now and then we'll get some kids of differing races that come through for camp or summer camp or a basketball clinic or something, and it doesn't matter.
Right. I think this was more about the observation of the donor populace than the populace of the kids that were involved.
Sure.
Because these are obviously, like you said, I think it's long-term impact is significant. I mean, even the our previous episode with Byron Kennedy, who you know, Byron, and he feels the same way, as if he had some kind of accountability person in his life, a father figure that actually not teaching right from wrong. Things are wrong, but if you don't have an accountability and a respect for any kind of consequence, then it changes your perspective on what is okay and what's not. I mean, his success story is more rare. And he even talks about the recidivism rate and everything else, and prisons and everything else. So this is the problem that started this whole Hope Farm idea, is that if you get to these kids and show them the accountability early, right, then if they are faced with a significant issue, then they can more readily make the right decision. They have the social tools to get them through certain situations. They've been mentored through, math and skills from everything from
reading.
Yeah, reading and
a lot of reading,
working a checkbook to table manners and everything else, so that they have every opportunity to go further and have that accountability. So I personally think that even if it were somewhat of a detriment, which I do not feel, to have primarily rich white donors, then I think ultimately the good outweighs the bad by tenfold. I mean, it's not even close, because you're creating an environment. Even if a kid from that poor neighborhood does make a bad decision, he can still rest on the lessons that he's learned in order to make recovery. He doesn't become part of the recidivism rate, doesn't become like their father was in most of the cases of these kids who are imprisoned and they don't have that figure. So like I said, I quite admire what you've done. I was super stoked to know that you were over there, because you're a powerful dude. Some folks.
Well, I try to. Like I said, trying to cash in on all this social capital has been interesting. But it gets back to what we're talking about, relationships and individual relationships and how you treat people. Because you never know when that person can use you, and you never know when you might need help from them.
Yeah.
So I was a little unsure because, like I said, my background from 20 plus years had been marketing, PR. So fundraising was a whole nother thing to learn, but it gets back down to those relationships. I mean, people, maybe they might write a check, but people who really contribute to a cause, they do it not because of the cause itself, but because of the relationship they have with an individual or with the organization.
Yeah, which is awesome. It says a lot about you too, the fact that it's moved ahead so well, and the changes that you're making along with Satcher. I think it's been a significant improvement, and I see nothing but great things. I really appreciate you sitting down and taking time to chat with me and share some of your story with folks that can learn something from other good people.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate you saying what you said, because now that I actually gotten to know you and know the type of person that you are, that means a lot to me. And I think the relationships that I've developed is something that has really, really been beneficial to me at Hope Farm, and hopefully in moving the program forward. We mentioned earlier, we've gone from one campus to 3 campuses in the last 18 months. So just getting the word out there and building more relationships, hopefully helping to change more lives.
Yeah. Well, if it's the least we do, then we've succeeded again today.
Well, good. Thank you.
Thanks, brother.
Don't look back now. Clean and cool, what you learned in school. It's artwork over fact. Freedom, gotta get free now. Welcome to the sun. happily. Do this for those before and after me. Trying to pass the baton forward like I'm athletes. Took mine and ran with it, now I'm thinking about the next generation. Give them a platform for progress. Butterfly effect, coming live and direct. Ain't no telling how our decisions will manifest. I ain't crying for help, I can do this on my own. Set my bread, build my wealth, and bring it